T minus 1 minute. T minus 50 seconds. T minus 40 seconds. T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hi and good afternoon. Welcome to the 28th iteration of the Time of the Writer Festival held by the Center for Creative Arts at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And of course, all of its generous sponsors at the Time of the Writer Festival. And so we're talking this year in the theme of imagination, freedom, and accountability. And in this specific session, we're looking at the question of memoir. We're looking at people's recollections, but also reflections of themselves and of others, subjects that they've written about. So please join me in welcoming the three formidable authors, fierce and formidable, I might add. And this is a session I would have relished actually doing in person, with no disrespect for any of the other sessions that I will do in person. But this is certainly one I would have loved to have done in person. But be that as it may, it's equally a privilege to be with them on this call and with all of you. So please join me in welcoming Margie Orford, who's a well-known author of crime novels, but now also of a memoir called Love in Fury. She has a PhD in English literature from University of East Anglia and has studied comparative literature, but has also practiced as a journalist. So welcome, Margie, and we'll kick off with you in a moment. Second, in probably what is a world first, where we're turning things on its head, and we're going to have an instance of women's splaining rather than a mansplaining. And Marcia Blumberg, a professor who is a professor of theatre and English, who was a professor at York University, started life as a school teacher professionally, but also started life in South Africa and then emigrated to Toronto and Canada with the husband, Gerald Henry Blumberg, or Henry Gerald Blumberg, and who practiced as a lawyer. So Marcia, unfortunately, sadly, Henry passed away, and you will be talking about his book, A Pocket Knife, Slices of My Life. So that would be interesting. And then welcome Arjumand Wajid, who's a graduate in philosophy and geography, who worked for an extensive period at the British Broadcasting Corporation at the BBC, and has had a history with South Africa from the 1990s. Who's written a memoir, who's written a biography, basically, I would think, not a memoir, perhaps it's a memoir, of time with Professor Fatima Meer, Born to Struggle, and that's the title of that biography. And equally, also as compelling as the other two. But let me begin with this, Margie. You, in your text, exhorted someone else who you met when you started your professional life, working for a publisher in Namibia. And you met someone who was involved in the liberation struggle, and you exhorted this person, Ellen, to write her biography, because you said, and I quote, "I'd probably understand myself better if you wrote your biography. I'd understand myself through your biography." And so after writing Love in Fury, do you perhaps think you understood yourself better? Are you at better grips reflecting on yourself, your life choices, but also on the people that you've met all along?
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be on this panel with you all. I also wish we were all together in one room, but the Zoom room will do fine. The person, So memoir, I've written plenty of novels, and in some ways I realized that what I was doing in writing novels was using fiction as a way of working out all sorts of things about violence and resilience and ethics and various things. But I started off as a publisher and as a commissioning editor in the 90s in Namibia, where I grew up, just at the end of the war. And I think I'll talk about Ellen Namila's book, which was her memoir, which kind of I made her write hers, and in some ways, 25 years later, mine came as a reply to Ellen, or as a response to Ellen. For me, writing memoir as a person from Southern Africa and a woman from that era, you have to engage with war, you have to engage with conflict, and you have to engage with how you navigate it as a person. Now, Ellen is exactly the same age as I am, a black Namibian woman who went in across the border when she was 13 years old in 1976. And I was a little white girl at the same time. So our experience of the war was, the long civil war in Namibia was on two sides. And in my friendship with her, my friendship as both a friend and as her editor, was her story illuminated a side of the conflict that I only read about and heard. So our experiences were completely different. And why I said to you, you have to write, I have to know what this is. And perhaps this goes to the heart of why people write memoirs. If she described being in Kasinga at the massacre, and she said the massacre happened, and then the story took off 2 days later, and she was somewhere else in a refugee camp. So I said to her, Ellen, what happened? And she said, the South Africans bombed. And I was naive. I said to her, what happened to you? What did you feel in your body? She disappeared for 6 months. And unbeknown to me, I'd sort of triggered this really traumatic return of memory of that thing. And she'd gone through it and she'd written it. And in the writing, she'd metabolized and given language to this unbelievably shattering event to a 15-year-old. So I learned two things, like think more before you ask people to write stuff down, but thank God they write it, because I could understand her experience. She gave me the gift of opening up the house of herself so that I could enter in it, inhabit it, understand what I was part of, and leave again intact, because in the writing, she had also come to find herself. So that lesson in memoir writing was really important for me when I came to write my own. Did I understand more? Did Ellen understand more? I asked her actually when I was in Windhoek for the launch of my own book, and she said when I finished the book, it was like I'd set something down and it had left me. And it was exactly the feeling I'd had with my own book. I had set things down on paper and put them into the world for other people to then pick up and inhabit. And I understood, for me, that memoir writing, it's not about narcissism. It's not about showing off. I mean, we've all read memoirs like that. They're terrible. You stop reading them on page 4. The memoirs I love are the ones which open up. It's an act of hospitality, where another person who maybe doesn't have the words or the understanding can enter into your story and do that reciprocal sharing, which I think is foundational to harmony and people and all of those sorts of things. So, yeah, do I understand more? Yes, I do in a way, but I have to read it to find my old self. She's that troubled woman who started writing that book, is now troubled by other things. So I'll have to write another one, but it's kind of set aside.
Well, we look forward to that. I mean, it's true, because when you write, in the memoir, in the style that you like reading, but also now have written in that style, you have to bear yourself, right? But in bearing yourself, you sometimes perhaps have to hurt some people who might read reflections of themselves in that memoir. And I'm thinking here, perhaps people you've come across, Aidan, your former husband being one of them, And I mean, so this is reflection not just of you, but a reflection of on other people too. Do you find, and I mean, this Ellen person also tells you, other than you telling her, you know, I'm going to understand myself better if you write. She tells you, Margie, do you know what you're asking me to do?
I
Are
didn't
you
know.
aware? Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't know. I didn't know what I was asking her. I'm so glad she wrote her book. I mean, the experiences of war, especially women in war in Namibia, are very sparse. And then the experiences of constructing a piece out of that are not many. So it's an invaluable document, hers, apart from a literary achievement. With the ethics of writing about other people are profound. I mean, I teach memoir writing as well. And writing a memoir is very different to therapy, or to revenge, or to all of those sorts of things. Often one starts perhaps with a desire to do those things. But for me, one of the most key elements is that you can write what you know to be true for yourself. But what you never know is what another person, why they do things. You can speculate all of those sorts of things. Fiction is the realm for that imaginative thing. But with writing about my ex-husband, and actually interestingly, writing this memoir was one of the real ways in which we have had a sort of rapprochement and a kind of mutual understanding, because we've spent so long. He was a man of many merits, but we didn't communicate well. And we couldn't, which is probably partly why our marriage broke down. But the memoir gave a way, it was like a triangulation, which we could sort of find a way of talking to each other. We didn't remarry, but it was a way of doing that. But it's a very delicate line, that question of ethics. And if I can answer it as a woman who writes, one of the injunctions, especially of a patriarchal society, is that women must keep quiet about the suffering that they endure in order not to make men feel uncomfortable, if I can distill it. So one of the things you do when you write a memoir as a woman, and as a woman in a very patriarchal society, is you navigate how to make it clear where one suffers, where one is thwarted, where other women are suffered. And part of your job, I think, as a female writer or a feminist writer, is to create that discomfort and to say, who was it? Loretta Kobo, I think, who wrote that famous book called And They Didn't Die, is that filling in of the silence around the silences which enable ongoing kind of hurt and various things. And also when you write it down and then you look at it and you look at yourself in the round and you have all your editors and your kids read it and various people read it, what you get to understand is something that you know to be true. I think I suffered a lot, and many women I know suffer. You know something is true and you can't believe it. I understood that disjunct between not being able to believe the truth of experience. And if we can merge those two, I think all marginalized people find it difficult. You can't believe that people treat you like this. Why can't you believe it? Because it's often unbearable. You would rather maintain a sense of yourself than actually believe that. So writing with a truthfulness that you believe them, and then instead of being a monster under your bed, you check it and it's actually just your old tacky.
Arjumand, that must have been fascinating for you, because I mean, you're a woman writing about another woman, albeit that you have a really close friendship with, someone who herself was a formidable and actually prolific writer. So now you, Arjumand, have to write about this woman who you have a friendship with, who herself would have been capable of writing, but got a bit ill towards the end and so couldn't. And so you faced both with the ethics of what Margie is raising about how you reflect the subject in your book. You have to grapple with the fact that you yourself, a journalist who's written a lot, who's reported a lot, who's played with words, and now you're playing with the words of someone else and reflecting their life, not just to them, but to the world outside.
Yes, I mean, it was quite a challenge in many, many ways. As you said, if I think of my own memories of coming to this country as a first generation immigrant and having gone through the difficulties of settling down and that, comparing that with her struggle and her memories of her childhood and growing up in that one of the most oppressive systems in the world. It was incredible, and you were able to put things in the right perspective. But in order to remember, I mean, why I feel it is important not to preserve and learn from the memories and the history, is that sadly we learn from the history that no sooner have the struggle and the difficulties overcome and the struggle is over, the younger generations particularly very soon begin to forget the struggle and the difficulties and the sacrifices that their parents' generation and the generations of their forefathers had gone through and had earned and won this freedom and the privileges that they are now living with. They tend to forget it. And so the lessons of the history are very soon forgotten. So it was not just the history of one woman or the memoirs of the one woman. It is the history in Fatima Meer's case, in this my book's case, is a history of the community. That is the Indian community in this case, who had the beginning of like coming as indentured laborers and the businesses starting with the little hawkers going door to door, which was the case in her father's case and in her grandfather's case. And this is the history of the whole city, that where she grew up, the history of the nation, who have long story about the sacrifices and about the struggle. And so it was, for me, it was in the most incredible time to be there. It was the most fortunate time. It was the most fortunate thing for me to be able to get to know her and to meet the people that could just narrate the history firsthand. So I learned the history in a way firsthand because I was learning it from the people who had gone through it, not just from the books and not just by reading and other people. As you would know that as non-whites, we were not able to enter South Africa before the apartheid was ended. So I arrived when Nelson Mandela was released and apartheid had ended, but I was still able to say that, yes, I was there. I saw how it was. I saw the apartheid being dismantled. So it was fairly quite first-hand knowledge and information and experience of meeting people who had gone through it. And so I almost felt that these memories were like my own memories. I was going through them. And so it was, on one hand, it was great. And on the other hand, it was for me difficult to keep the balance and to see how not to personalize it so much and to keep it objective and keep it honest. So that for me was the most important aspect, that I learned it from her, I heard it from her, and at the same time, I need to put it in the perspective of other people's experiences and how much there was the personal experience and how much there were the experience of the whole community and the country.
And yeah.
Uh,
Muted.
Thanks, Arjumand. And Marcia, obviously, you come at this slightly differently in that you're speaking about a biography, memoirs, memories of someone who'd written them themselves. But you have to read this. And obviously you're also reflected in it, not just reading it, but you're an intimate part of Henry's life. But just before we get to that how do you think he would have thought of? Do you think he knew himself better after he had written this? Do you think you understood him a little better after he'd written this? Because what's common is that, sure, Margie's grown up with the struggle in Namibia, partly exposed to it in South Africa when she was a student at UCT. Herself wrote exams in prison, but if you want to know, you'd have to get the book to read that. Marcia, Henry also grew up in the milieu of some kind of conflict. As a child, he was going through the Second World War. He was living in a community in a small town where most of his playmates were Afrikaans children whose parents supported the Osava Brandwag and so on. Do you perhaps think that you got a better appreciation after the process of writing the memoir, but you also after reading it?
Thanks very much for the opportunity of being able to be here and share this panel with very experienced writers. If I can quickly put it in context, I was together with Henry for 60 wonderful years. So very much a teamwork with everything except for his law clients. That I knew nothing about. But anyway, he shared everything. And although we had 4 children and a busy household, we always bonded together. That was very special. Not just when you say a woman explaining a man's job, he wouldn't have minded that at all. He would have been thrilled because there was no sense of inequality. It's quite surprising when I think of many men from South Africa that I knew. He really respected me as an individual, another mind, another being, another set of emotions and ideas, and we shared. And when we differed, but there was never any upset or hatred or anything negative. It was an amazing 60 years. It really was. And he passed away the end of April, and his wonderful personality and wisdom and all the things that I lived with for 60 years are what keeps me going. I teach full-time at the university, but theatre, not memoir writing. So I feel my job, he wrote 2. The first one, I'll tell you in one sentence, was after our youngest son, Sean, at the age of 35, took his own life. So I was able to speak to friends. I never went to groups or sessions, although I believe they can be wonderful. But Henry couldn't talk about it, only to me. And that's when the writing of that book became so important to him. And he had wonderful notes and letters and emails and Facebook things from people who said, you have no idea what your journey has meant to me. We are going through a journey that's similar. So after 15 years of real struggle with depression and paranoia, we understood why he had wanted to do this. Anyway, that was the first one. And he went to a writing course because what he had to unlearn was legalese. After 50 years as a lawyer, you cannot write as a lawyer if you're writing memoirs. And so he did creative nonfiction. From there, in the first case, he would sometimes say, would you like to read this? And then share it with me. With the second one, completely different. It was during COVID. And during lockdown, we were told by our family doctor, you've got lots of illnesses that you're both dealing with very well, but whatever happens, it's also age. Henry was in his 80s. You don't go out. You are in your home. So our family were able to come in summer and sit on the deck outside, otherwise FaceTime, phone calls, all of that, but they never went into our house for a long time. So it was just the 2 of us together. And he had this time, he'd retired, where he was writing. And he thought about how he would write about his life, because that's what he wanted to do. And this book is from 8 years old to 84, going from South Africa and the village to Port Elizabeth, to Cape Town at university with all his activities there, and then living in Port Elizabeth, working as a lawyer, and eventually emigrating to Toronto with, of course, all of us. So that's just the background. But he wrote so honestly. And one of the things he learned from the first memoir was when the person reading it said, Henry, dig deeper. Men don't usually expose their vulnerabilities and their fears and all of that. Even in this memoir, fear is a constant little part, not a huge part, because Henry never allowed it to get him down. It was just a challenge. When his grandfather's business was burned down in the country, and there was talk also about welcoming any of Hitler's people to their little village, this was something that stayed with him from a child. But he was never a fearful person, and he took risks, and he was prepared when he needed to take those risks to follow through. He had incredible sense of knowing what he should do. And sometimes, and the book is like a thriller, up and down, the various challenges, the times where we never thought we'd get to the next day, and then suddenly things were going well. And some of it is incredibly funny. He's got wonderful wit, which I don't have, unfortunately, but he has. So it was a matter of, would you please read this chapter? And then I said, on condition, of course I'll read it. I was teaching my university courses on Zoom from home during COVID. I want to discuss it with you straight away while it's all fresh, and I could ask him. And of course, I could say to him, have you thought of this? Or perhaps try something here and see if it works for you. But I could never say, it was never my book to say, don't or do or whatever. It was his book. And I learned so much because interpretive theater is my life now. And of course, my grandchildren and children. But it's not the same as writing a memoir. And I learned enormously from every chapter we discussed. So for me, it was a very special privilege to be part of that. And the only last quick thing that I'd like to say is, how was the book conceived and created? He thought about it. How can he tell a life story? That can be very boring. You go from this year to that year to the next. No, that's not what he wanted to do. And then sitting in our family room, which is one of the places he loved to write, on a baby iPad. He wrote both memoirs on this baby iPad. He said, look what he was a great collector. Wherever we traveled, whatever we did, he collected. So he said, look, this brings back that memory. This is something else. And so suddenly he was surrounded by all these memories. And then he went and started looking in the basement for his special green treasure suitcase, in which he had unbelievable things, some of which I knew nothing about. So that's how the book came to be framed during COVID, but with memories that were surrounding him. And so the book is not one note, one line. It's very rich and varied and funny and serious and scary and worrying and all these things. But at some stage, I'd like to just read you the ending of the book, but I'm not going to do that now, okay? I don't know if that answered you, the question.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's just one quick thing I wanted to point out. You were talking about fear and danger, and I mean, those are they're not an overt, long, big part of the narrative, but they're certainly lurking there. And you hear it several times in the book where Henry's father says to him, the trouble with you is you don't know danger. And there's other times in the book where his father says to him, the trouble with you is you never act with caution. Was that your experience, perhaps, that he didn't know danger or he didn't act with caution?
I would say yes and no, both. He did know danger, and he certainly became aware, but one of the things I didn't say was the incredible influence of his dad. His dad died the year before I met Henry, so I never actually met him. But he was such a formative influence, and he was concerned about a general education, not any specific named field. He said, learn from life, learn from people. And Henry loved talking to people. People he knew, people he didn't know, and he learned a lot that way. But the danger part is also to do with perseverance. if you're really in a hole, metaphorically speaking, how do you get out of it? It may be a bit dangerous, but you've got to persevere. So that was something that Henry really it was in his DNA. And his dad was very, very important. When he won his first case as a lawyer, he wrote, "The one thing I missed was not being able to phone my dad and tell him that I'd missed, that I'd won the case." And that, yes, a general education was important because he won it on his knowledge of science, not on his knowledge of law. So that was, really important. So it's always complicated is the answer I'm sorry to have to give you. Yes and no.
Arjumand, the person who certainly didn't know danger or who sometimes didn't appear to act with caution, but also for someone whose father was a formidable influence in their life was Fatima Meer. Incidentally, her father, I don't know if this is well known, but it certainly does come out strongly in the book, had literally two wives, and Fatima's mother was she regarded the Indian mother, so to speak, as a real mother, but her actual biological mother was a white woman, originally called Rachel. So, Arjumand, did you get a sense, both in interacting with Fatima, you obviously wouldn't have met her father, but and it comes out strongly in the book in the way in which you presented in the first, it's a big, long chunk of the first section of the book, her own origins, the origins of the family, but the father's immersion and in shaping her own worldview, but also her mother's, the maternal role in shaping her worldview.
Yes, actually, it was a very complex story and complex picture. You're quite right. Her father played a very important role in her life, but almost equally, it was her uncle, the father's younger brother that she called Gora Papa. He was actually her role model, and she idolized him. And he played probably almost even more important. And let's not forget Ismail Meer, who the relationship with her changed from very early childhood until the last moments of his life. He obviously was the most prominent and the strongest influence in her life. But you spoke about the mothers. Yes, the older mother, which was basically, as you said, Indian mother. She called Badi Ma, and everybody called Badi Ma because Badi means the older. She played extremely important role in her childhood because, as you said, her biological mother, a white woman who eloped with a much older Indian shopkeeper, like unbelievable scandal for the whole society, for the family. And actually, Fatima Meer almost enjoyed telling the story about their eloping and their running away. She used to giggle the fact that, there was the whole family was hub with the gossip that her father had run away with a young girl, and now they were hiding away here and there until he married her very soon and made it legitimate. And then he had to bring her back to the family and introduce her, and the struggle of the young white wife being accepted in the family and all that. She loved telling those stories and used to giggle all the way. But the story of Rachel, and I feel sometimes that I wish I had the time and opportunity to actually write her story. The way she was introduced into this Indian family, totally different culture, and now she had to be Muslimized and she had to be Indianized, and she changed the dress and all that. And then, of course, being the younger wife and being the outsider, she throughout her life never really achieved the status of an equal wife, remained almost in the shadow of the older wife, and she accepted that, and that's how the relationship worked so beautifully and perfectly, that she never really became a rival, and she never complained about the fact that she was like a junior. And so, like a team, like a younger sister and older sister, they worked throughout. It's an incredible story. And the whole situation, I think, was what formed her character. But then very soon after, I mean, she used to love telling the story that her own mother was much more disciplinarian, and she would, anytime she did anything wrong, her crown came off. That is the chappal, the shoes, the slipper came off. And it was the older mother, the stepmother basically, who intervened and who basically would save her. And she also patronized her, and she took her everywhere with her. And so it was the older mother that she associated with. And her basically the so-called the umbilical cord was attached to the older mother. And she didn't want people to say that she was the daughter of Amina Ma, that is the white woman. So this was very complex story of the childhood. And then as she grew older, I think the influence of the father and the grandfather, and gradually also Ismail's, grew more and more. Gora Papa, as she called her uncle, he took her everywhere. And he was the one who basically politicized her more. He would take her for lectures, he would take her for rallies and so on. And that was basically also the reason why she was far more closer to the political views and ideology of the Gora Papa, the uncle, than her father. Her father was actually more conservative. And also when it came down to the politics of the subcontinent, and this is another background that makes up the story, is that at the same time, the struggle for freedom in India was also going on. And so for the diaspora in South Africa and everywhere else, that was also a very important backdrop. It was also part of their discussions and the stories in the house. And there again, her father stood on the other side, and her uncle and Ismail Meer both were on one side. And they were both the followers of India, the Gandhi, and were supporter of India remaining one country, whereas the father supported Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and he was in favor of the partition and the fact that Muslims should have their own independent country. So Fatima actually took the same line as her uncle and Ismail Meer. She was a Gandhiite, very strong Gandhiite. She wrote so much about Gandhi and the Gandhi's family. She was very close to Ira Gandhi and, in fact, their father and so on. And so those influences grew as she grew older. Ismail Meer, whom she knew as uncle, then when she went to the university, he was like an older brother or an uncle. She went to Wits, where he was already studying, and she saw him as uncle, and she was being introduced as his niece, and saw his relationship with Ruth First. As you know, Ruth First was Ismail Meer's girlfriend. And so they were like an item, and she saw them going out together, and they took her to the parties. And so she was introduced to this whole new world where all whites and blacks and Indians, they came together and they ate together, and in some cases drank together, and had a fantastic social life as well. So this was a whole new world that she was introduced to through Uncle Ismail, as she called him then. And then, of course, when he had to come back when he finished, obviously because of the apartheid laws, he could not stay in Johannesburg anymore. So he came back and started his practice. And then her parents decided that she should come back to Durban and finish her degree there. And during that time, they used to get together in her uncle's house, that is Gora Papa's house, who was married to Ismail Meer's sister. Lots of intermarriages in the Indian community. And so that's where they very often got together, right, under the eyes of her auntie and uncle. Nothing hanky-panky going on. But during that interaction and relationship, the relationship gradually changes from uncle to equal, and then basically romance. So this very innocent romance sprung and grew and developed very much within the sort of discipline of the family and so on. And so these influences throughout played a very important role in her life. And fathers remained in the background, but he was actually the one who I would say was the central force, because in that community, in Indian community, where at that time the girls' education was even not allowed. Very few girls had the same kind of freedom. Not only to go to school and then go on to university, but even within the social circles, she was allowed to go out. She went to, let's say, picnics with her friends, and as she grew older, she organized groups of her own classmates and women, girls, and then she involved the boys. So when they were doing like fundraising for first the Bengal famine, and then she was basically, while she was still an undergraduate, there were the riots in between the blacks and the Indians community. Very famous. I forget the name now. What they called, in which they basically the blacks attacked Indian businesses and so on. And so she was very much involved in that. So
Cato Manor.
freedom could not have come
Right.
unless her father had allowed it, unless the family agreed with it. And so the father remained a very strong character, even though at times he seemed to be in the background, and Gora Papa and Uncle Ismail, or Ismail, the husband later on, taking a stronger role.
Yeah, well, certainly even locally, Fatima's father actually supported the Natal Indian Association, whereas the others were aligned to the Natal Indian Congress. So that kind of political influence from her uncle and so on was pretty formidable. Margie, your dad was obviously also a formidable influence, a surgeon, a medical doctor, a gynecologist. But someone who you kind of, your sister seemed to have been much more influenced or was closer to him than you were. You had Margie, a kind of in-out kind of not affiliation, but an in-out relationship. Not that you weren't close to him, your mother too. Certainly no intermarriage. In the same way that Arjumand's pointing out was true for Fatima Meer. But I mean, you also at points in your life were kind of, didn't know danger. Obviously, if you ended up writing exams in prison, and at other times were reticent, did know danger, were averse to risk, and then got frustrated because you weren't able to express yourself, or you felt hemmed in, if I could say that, by marriage.
He's muted.
After all this time, we still mute you. You're muted, Margie.
My dad would be happy to know I was muted every now and then. No, fathers and their daughters, or daughters and their fathers, always a complicated story. My father, we had this sort of passionate conflict, hand-to-hand mortal combat, but also very similar kinds of minds in many ways. He always says I was perfect until I was 12, which of course is the moment of puberty. And I think that what that physical change represents for many fathers in all, I mean, South Africa, whatever color or race or religion you were, is a very conservative society in terms of views of what men should do and what women should do, and how what women do reflects on their fathers. But yeah, we have had a lot of run-ins, I think, in many ways, because my father, who is a true born colonial in many spheres, imagined the sphere of men and women to be different ones. So he saw them, many men say this, they're two and they're complementary, but the complementary thing means that you get to do the washing up and the man gets to like sally forth in washed clothes that are washed by them. You know what I mean? So that sort of unfair, that sort of disparity bugged me. And I have to say, I found, some of what you write in a memoir, you find threads and strands of various things around depression and anxiety and very, psychological things that Marcia spoke so movingly about with her own son. I've had those. Feminism for me was a political solution to many of those. Also, the anti-apartheid struggle with a very profound sense of unfairness and injustice in society. And I often thought that having grown up in a patriarchal family which viewed itself as benign, it didn't give me the experience of what it felt like to be a South African of color. But I could recognize the enraging frustration of being limited in your potential and your capacity and your right to speak because of the body you inhabited. So it's a complex meshing. With the fear business, one of the things I realized with my memoirs, how much trauma and shock I've dealt with simply by splitting it off. And one of the things that happens, which is a great advantage to a journalist, is I just would switch off my fear switch. I didn't feel it. But that sort of disassociation is professionally useful, but harmful as well. And one of the processes I uncovered with writing, and what Marcia was saying struck me profoundly, is you don't know what you're doing when you start, but some of it, I think, a person who writes a memoir, it's a desire to understand ruptures in their own lives, rupture and connection. You're doing both at the same time. And to understand that it's all right to feel fear. You will survive emotions, very strong emotions. You will withstand grief, but only if you work with it. If you stand against it, it knocks you down, which was my experience, I suppose, of having a kind of breakdown. It was like I stood too much like that tree in the hurricane instead of bending. Sometimes you just need to let the winds kind of go over you. With my sister, tragically she died while I was writing the book, which interrupted me and my feeling of this intense grief, because we were very close. I have one memory that precedes her. And she and I were like the sort of feeling people in our family. I was a different person after her death, and after I'd sort of gone through the grief. But she was basically nicer than me, more amenable, and in some ways she couldn't escape the influence and control of my father. She wanted to be a doctor, as he was a doctor, and he kind of persuaded her to do nursing. And as she got older, it really angered her, the sort of feeling that often what seems like protection is also disabling. I refused any protection, which is also a disabling response, if you know what I mean, because people are always a mixture, a kind of complex mixture. I mean, what Arjumand was saying about Fatima Meer and the two mothers, it was really striking to me how the domestic politics between those two mothers and that brilliant daughter. I mean, I can imagine those two women would both want to claim Fatima Meer as their daughter. How those things play out. And that is an area that I'm interested in, is how it works out in the family. And how you arm wrestle your father, and how it is in families that you can intensely dislike someone or feel frustrated by people and love them and protect them at the same time. You know, there isn't an easy switch. And I suppose part of the crafting of memoir is finding a form of kind of synthesis, so saying what happened, understanding what happened. And my impulse of my life is I like, my politics could be summed up by saying I want the least worst for the most people. And in family arrangements, I think sometimes the least worst for the most people kind of works, but not if people have to lie, not if people have to pretend it was fine to put up with those things. So you can say it, talk it out, and then shift the battle onto something else if you want, but kind of move on. My family is also very waspy. There, you know, that white Anglo-Saxon wasp thing of repression, which makes people mad in the end. And there's often relief when you put it on the table and say, okay, let's talk this out. And your energy can go into not keeping secrets.
you found that relief when you were able to start writing, right? And you could sort of give up the kind of domesticity which you appear to have become accustomed to
Yeah,
when
I
you were
was
in London.
hoodwinked into, it was a shock. It was a shock. The banishment of a woman from the world just because you have a baby. You know what I mean? It's really,
Yeah.
really shocking. I was very young, so and it was really psychologically shocking to me, and I had to sort of find my way back into saying I'm both a mother and a person. Like no father
And
ever
and the
has to prove his personhood.
and the prompt had to come from a sort of graphic designer at a printer shop who made you a set of cards in which it just
Yeah.
said, write it.
Write it in bright orange. I got such a fright because she was listening to what I was describing, what I did, and then she just said, "Yeah, I'm a writer." So that label from somewhere else was both affirming and sort of
It's,
humiliating. But I write to understand. I write with when I have a question to which I have no answer. It'd be too boring if I already knew the answer. Yeah, so it was a way of kind of figuring why I'd upended my life, because I also realized if you're driven by things, sort of trauma is an overused word, but experiences that have shaped you, you often don't see the tectonics underneath, which is making you behave in a certain way. So now when I behave, it's with full knowledge and I'm the idiot. I can't blame anybody else, any buried memories. But I wanted to say something about this memoir. The thing that surprised and shocked me the most was when I was touring it in South Africa last year and promoting it. And when it came out, and subsequently, I've had so many letters from men, to my astonishment. One of them, my 84-year-old farmer uncle, my dad's brother, who wrote to me, farms near Klerksdorp in the northwest, so not exactly a gentle part of the world. And he wrote to me and he said, "Margie, your book was astonishing. It helped me understand my wife who just passed away and how she was and where and why we had these difficulties and why she did." And it was very moving to me. So he was one example, but there were many men who wrote to me and said, "You've helped us understand the women in our lives." And one of the things I wanted to say, with three women on the panel talking about partly human rights, partly how to be a person in the world and record it, is with this big crisis we see in America around misogyny, racist misogyny all over Europe, it's on the rise as well. Is that labor, that emotional labor that women can do in their understanding is really important to shaping what we do with young men particularly, and how we shore up the rights of women, young women in particular. And some of it is that bodily truthfulness, I think, of what it feels like to live in a particular body and how it's affected by the systems and people around it.
Marcia, you obviously, from Henry's sense of kind of being a person in a maelstrom of so much change, but and in some cases also difficulty. But like Margie was kind of prompted by an object, a business card which simply said Margie Orford, writer. Henry also, and by the way, before I ask this question, you might also just want to quickly meditate for viewers and listeners why he had two names. Growing up, in the first couple of years, he was known as Gerald, and then decided decisively, I no longer want to be Gerald. I'm Henry, and that's what you must call me. But talking about the objects, I mean, the slices of my life are often periodized or kind of set up on the basis of these little objects, the pocket knife being one, the father's revolver being another, the dog tag of the pet dog, Pagel, or however you would pronounce it, Pagel, and then the kind of little masks, puppets, toys, trinkets, things that you've collected from museums, galleries, whatever, which are shown to the grandchildren, and each one is kind of associated with a story. I mean, what was it that drove him to kind of just keep all these little things? I don't want to call them trinkets.
No, they're not. Well, thank you for the opportunity. He was an inveterate collector. We're both only children. And I don't know, I collect certain things. But in his last conversation to me in hospital, he said, I apologize for leaving you with a mammoth task. The decluttering. Some things I'll never, ever be able to give away other than to my children. And I must say about the children, the 3 boys now left of the 4 have been a mainstay of my life. They are everything that was good about Henry. They've obviously imbibed, and they know how important he was to me. So without a physical Henry there, they've divided me up into 3 areas: legals, finance, and everything else. And they each take on those jobs lovingly and caringly. But the one person I wanted to mention earlier was my granddaughter, Kate, because when Henry knew he was very ill and that he'd finished the book, it was the last thing he did, he asked Kate if she would read the author's proof. He knew there was no way he could do it. And sitting for 5 weeks in the hospital, there was no way I could do it either. So that was a labor of love. And she said yes immediately. And she went through, and every alteration she made, she had a meeting with me. She'd sleep over in the house. And for 2 hours, we would talk about these 3 chapters and if there was anything there and did I agree or not. Incredibly respectful. But in that last conversation, Henry said to me, will you see that the book is published? And of course, because of Kate and my own work as well with her, that book has been published, and it was an enormous promise. Because legacy, you asked me about the objects. Legacy is important, and the stories, they aren't trinkets. You're right when you say not trinkets. They are the dog tag, he has 40 pictures in the book. The dog tag was from his beloved dog. The name change that you mentioned was, his name is Henry Gerald Blumberg. But his parents, and he found out later, could never, ever say his name Henry. Why? Because he was named after an uncle who died at the age of 2 when he fell out of the motor car on the mother's lap, and there were no seatbelts. The mother survived, the child died. Little Harry. So it was too painful for them to ever say the word Henry. It was too near. So Gerald, but the children in the country used to laugh. Gerald, it's so funny, and tease him, and goodness knows. So when he came to university at Cape Town, who are you? I'm Henry Blumberg. And that was it. And the family but one thing about the book, the publication of the book, amazing things happen. There's synchronicity. I believe in that. I mean, I met Henry on the phone, and on our second date, he asked me to marry him. I was 17, and I said yes. We didn't get married until I was 19, because we were both finishing university. But as we were walking to the cars that were taking us for the funeral, for Henry's funeral, I noticed on the patio there was a parcel. I didn't want anyone to trip. I picked it up, opened it, the proof copies of his book, as we were going to the funeral. So I took a copy with me because I did the eulogy for Henry, and I showed it. It meant the world to him. The book, the writing, and his family. So this was going to be a legacy for his grandchildren. And he ends the book in the most wonderful way with his 84th birthday. Under lockdown, celebrated in 4 houses with Zoom, the 3 surviving sons and their families, and me, him and I. And we each had a little cake, which my one son delivered to the stoop of the house because he couldn't come in. And he said, why are you doing a birthday party? I don't want gifts. I said, no, Henry. I've said there are to be no physical gifts. What each one please should do is just tell a little story, a little anecdote, share a memory of Henry at any stage in their lives. And it was through travel, through help, through a million things. One said he was the best teacher. He'd had 31 teachers, but Henry was the best one. And it was the time he wanted to spend with them and gave to them because he adored them. So, these things, there it was, the book, which my granddaughter proofread because he couldn't and I couldn't. And this week was the first time I've read the book in total, from early in the morning through till I finished it late at night, and realized, when you say, what do you learn? I learned how many of his father's traits, the wanting to share the knowledge, the wanting to share stories. And that's why the question to me was the ask, please buy hard-covered copies for the family. I want them to be able to keep it and read it and know more about me. He made a huge impression on them, as he did on me. So thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, we could talk about this and these three very rich texts for a long time, but unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. We've got a couple minutes, just a couple. So just very shortly, I wanted to touch on something which is what all of the writers were fundamentally political beings, more so Fatima, given that her whole life was dedicated to it. And the sort of year 1948 was a really crazy period in history. The partition of India and split into India and Pakistan, the splitting asunder of Palestine, the creation of the State of Israel, and then the formation of apartheid and the formal inception of apartheid in South Africa in 1948. And I mean, each of these writers were fundamentally political. So just to sum up their politics in a moment before we round off, and that would be your final stab at this before we try and conclude. So Arjumand, to start with you, given that you have the most overtly political figure that you wrote about, Henry was also quite political. I mean, the fact that he left South Africa was based on a set of political reasons. And Margie, you get early on in the book that, there is a reason why you wrote certain exams in prison. But if you want to know why Margie was also an amateur zoologist, you'd have to get the book to know why. How she ended up being an amateur zoologist, or tried to be a zoologist, but then resisted being that. But anyway, just to start off with your Arjumand, Fatima's, and your own politics in the way in which it shaped you.
You quite the politics for Fatima obviously was the politics of the time. The main mission in life was the liberation and the equal rights and human rights. But it also impacted on their views about, as you said, about the politics back home, as they would say. And then at the same time, in her later in her life, of course, the world politics, the Palestinian issue was very, very close to her heart. She was concerned still about the Indian and Pakistani politics, but not nearly as much. At the same time now, she was faced with a new picture in her own country that the liberation is won, however, then not necessarily all the human rights are won. So now she was not just concerned about the human rights all over, but also the fact that the same difficulties still remained within her own country. And so she basically turned round and took a role of a critic of her own government, and the government that she fought all her life to create, and the ANC's government and the government of a democratic government of their own people. And yet she felt very unhappy, the fact that all those promises and all those hopes were not being fulfilled, and the communities were still suffering. And so there are very famous stories about her, standing there facing the same kind of police officers that she might have done during the apartheid, but now they were the police officers of her own government and her own local council, and she's challenging them and asking them, why are you now oppressing these people who are still suffering, and also raising the questions with her own council that why is it that these people are not have not got their rights, and they have no homes, and they have no education, and the children have no playing fields, or etc., etc. And similarly, challenging the central government policies. Why is it that still people are suffering and people are still living in shacks and they don't have homes and the water that you promised and so on? So her politics remained the same: human rights, fighting against the injustices, and achieving the better life for those who are the oppressed. But the people that she was fighting remained different at the time. There was the international politics, and she's leading the marches basically against the oppression and the atrocities going on in Palestine. And then she's still worried about what's happening in India. And then, but most of all, I think it at that time still remained closer to heart and closer to home, and fighting for the people that she was living with. So that's how, her politics remained and her struggle went on.
Obviously, fundamentally, none of you are actually dogmatically, or even Henry was not dogmatically politics. And it so turned out that Fatima was not actually formally a member of the ANC, and it brought sympathies with both the ANC, the Congress movement, and the Black Consciousness movement. But you obviously have to get the book if you want to explore her politics, her academics. Yeah. Marcia, I mean, Henry was quite political, not as overt perhaps, but I mean, the whole act of leaving the country was premised on a politics.
Yes, it was, but it was much more than that. He was on the Student Representative Council. He worked at Shawko in the townships. He did all kinds of things that showed he cared about human beings and human rights. So it's not so much, although of course we voted for Helen Suzman and the Progressives, but we felt, what could we as individuals do to make things better? And actually nothing, because we didn't have that power. But from Toronto, we were able to do tiny things. I brought a lot of theatre, South African theatre, to Toronto, not paying for it, but introducing it, encouraging them. You have to take this one. Why take this show? So he did lots of other things, and founded a foundation for the university, all sorts of things. But he was very caring about individuals. And so we have an amazing range of really close friendships with gay men who are just incredibly wonderful. And when I hear all these terrible things going on south of the border, one of my friends, one of our closest friends, actually said to me a little while ago, he said, it's terrible that Henry's gone and I miss him so much. But I'm glad about one thing, that he isn't alive to see the cruelty. It's not just craziness. If it's craziness, it's one thing, but it's craziness and cruelty and percepticide, turning blindly away from what you should be noticing and dealing with. So it was something that was really very much part of our lives. And can I read one line here from the end of the book? Be very quick. This is after the 84th birthday, and everybody had given their gifts, which was their memories. There will be no need for me one day to look down through the clouds and listen to the customary tributes of mourners standing near my coffin in a chapel. The many gifts I've received at this Zoom birthday are far more meaningful than the words of any eulogy. Now, knowing that, I went to give his eulogy. So it was a real challenge, but the point is that he was so grateful, and that's what I've taken to allow myself to live, the practice of gratitude. And it's genuine because you can't hold on to it. It'll, if it's pretense, it's going to disappear in 2 days. My children have been amazing. He is and was amazing. And so I love teaching. That's very important. So I feel incredible gratitude despite his loss, which is immense. And I hope he would have been
Margie, you
satisfied.
also, I'm sure he has. It's been a beautiful book to read. Margie, you also unfortunately suffered loss. Your sister, your dear sister, who died not so long ago. But just a quick one, because we have to wrap up. The next sessions begin very soon.
And they're knocking at the Zoom gates.
Absolutely. I mean, I can hear them battening down.
Oh my God. So there's a little message there saying goodbyes, but I just want to say my politics, you asked about that. There was that famous struggle slogan, each one, teach one. And that stayed with me. And I thought, I'm a writer, and the relationship of a writer and a reader, even though you're doing your actions at different times, is very intimate. And so my readers teach me, and I can teach, and there's that Mobius strip of connection. So that my political practice has been women's rights, freedom of speech, and then the thing that one has to do if you come from a bad place, South Africa as it was, Israel, Palestine now, is to bear witness and to write things down. And that was my curse and gift, both at the same time, is the capacity and the ability to do that. So that is still what it is. It's just each one, teach one. So goodbye.
And that's a great note to end on. Thank you so very much, Arjumand,
Thank you for
Marcia,
teaching us.
and Margie. And I think it's a great note to end on. Each one, teach one. People, get the book. Each book is beautifully written. It's evocative. It's emotional. They are delicious turns of phrase. They're easy to read, but they're also demanding in some way. They require of you some kind of attention. With that, please get the book. Quickly before we go, Margie, your book's all over, everywhere, in airports, bookshops, everywhere. Arjumand, your book, where do we get it?
And unfortunately, distribution has been a problem, but I think you can get it from Ike's Books in Durban, and also from the Mandela Foundation and Kathrada Foundation. They have the books.
And Marcia, Henry's book was very hard to get. I eventually had to get it off Kindle in the US, which was very hard. So you need to tell us, how are we going to get this book? Because it's a great book to get.
Right. Well, in North America, it's easy with Amazon or London, England. But in South Africa, it was a problem. And there are lots of bookstores that will, if you put the name in, The Pocket Knife, Slices of My Life, you'll get lots of different places advertising it on the internet. But whether they go to South Africa or not, that is another thing, unfortunately.
Oh, sanctioned smokkel again.
Well, with that, on that,
to bring it and back. Sorry.
On that naughty and salacious note, thank you very much, Margie, Marcia, and Arjumand. It's been a great pleasure. I wish we had more time, and I wish we could do this in person. Perhaps Time of the Writer, we can have iteration 2 next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ebrahim.
Thank